And finally tonight, we look at the career of pop artist Andy Warhol, who died yesterday in New York of a heart attack after surgery. One of this country's most famous artists, Warhol as a personality became as celebrated as any of his artworks, always instantly recognizable with his pale face and shock of white hair. A filmmaker, writer, and editor, Warhol gained national prominence in 1962 when he exhibited paintings of Campbell's soup cans in San Francisco. His art often centered on popular images or on movie stars, such as Marilyn Monroe. Fame was, in fact, a key subject of Warhol's work and intimately bound up in his personality. He once said, "In the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes." Here with us to tell us some more about Andy Warhol is Ami Wallach, chief art critic for the newspaper Newsday. Ms. Wallach, was Andy Warhol a talent, or was he a phenomenon of publicity?
Well, I mean, part of his talent was, in fact, publicity. He was an enormous talent, and his greatest talent was that he was able to focus in on something that our society had become and something that we didn't talk about or didn't recognize, which is, he called it things that were bought and sold, the harsh reality of things that were bought and sold. The Campbell's soup cans, and in many ways the Marilyn Monroes, and in many ways all the parties he went to. He said that he'd go to the opening of an envelope. All that that's the commercial thing that happens in our society, and it's also much of what the American dream has become, and he was able to not only identify it, but identify it with him. And one of the ways he did that was through the techniques of publicity, which of course are part of the techniques of the commercial world. He
was trained as a commercial artist. Was he more than a very skilled commercial artist? Did he have a talent beyond that? I mean, as a painter?
Well, you know, part of the difference between a commercial artist and also a craftsman is that you have an idea. The idea is a very important part of the whole thing. And of course he had an idea. That was really what he did. But aside from that, his images are quite gorgeous, I think. Although he drained them of emotion and he drained them of painterliness and he made them into something that looked mass-produced. In fact, it wasn't. Although he used mass-produced techniques, they're quite beautiful. I think you'd have to agree that Marilyn with all those colors happening in her is beautiful.
Well, let's look at some of the paintings. Let's go back first and slow down a little bit on the three that we looked at a moment ago. The Campbell's soup can. Why is that an important piece of art? Is he having us on there or what?
Well, you know, part of that was that he wanted to be an artist. He wanted to be not this commercial artist who did shoes for I. Miller, but he wanted to be part of the art scene. And around the time that, a few years actually before he was doing a Campbell's soup can, other artists were beginning to do things like, that came out of society, Coke bottles and something they found on the street and comic strips and things like that.
So he didn't invent pop art?
No, not at all, but he wanted to be part of it. And one of the ways was to find things that were completely contemptibly common. Something that was just there. And the Campbell's soup can, he once said that, well, he ate Campbell's soup every day for 20 years, was there, instantly recognizable, probably more American than apple pie.
What about the Marilyn Monroe portrait?
Well, the Marilyn Monroe portrait it's very similar in many ways to the Campbell's soup can, because Marilyn Monroe is as American as American pie, and instantly recognizable, and a glamorized fantasy of who we think we want to be. And he showed her the way she looked pretty much in magazines. He did things to the color. And he showed the Campbell soup can exactly the way it is, without commenting on it, and that was pretty shocking in those days.
And his self-portrait, tell us about that.
Well, he did to himself exactly what he did to both the Campbell soup can and Marilyn Monroe, which means he made himself a media event. He made himself an image you'd see on a billboard or an image you'd see in a magazine, and it had the distance and the glamour of seeing something you'd see in a magazine or on a billboard, and made him as good as Marilyn Monroe in many ways.
Let's look at his portrait of money. And tell us, when he did something like this, how was he different from other people who were doing this kind of thing? What?
Well, he did money because he was in love with money. And so that's also part of the American dream. But what was different about the way he did it was that he did it dead on. he did money the way money looks. He didn't try to make it look like a painting, although there's a lot of real painting in there, and also the multiple image, which in many ways is a way we're accustomed to looking, because when we look at a film strip, we look at...
Are each of those dollar bills, are they individually painted, or did he paint one and then sort of mechanically reproduce the others?
He painted each one.
He painted each one.
Later on, in his later work, he would paint part of the painting and then silk screen over it, like he'd silk screen the Marilyn Monroe image or the Elvis Presley image over the painting. But at that point, he was painting each one.
And now what, again, is different from what the others were doing? Why?
Well, the other pop artists at the time, and we're talking, well, Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns kind of ushered it in, but we're talking about Roy Lichtenstein and Jim Rosenquist and people like that. They stood back with a certain amount of irony about the whole thing. They were saying, well, this is the culture, and look what it is. And they were trained painters. They came out of the fine art tradition, and they looked at it that way. Well, Andy was a commercial artist, and he just did it. He did it the way he did commercial art. He knew about rubber stamps and logos and that kind of thing, and he did it that way.
So there was no irony in what he was doing. He wasn't making a judgment about it. He was
he was identifying with it. He liked it. He didn't think there was anything good or bad about the culture. It was part of him.
We also have a picture of the Mona Lisa that he did. Tell us about that.
Well, the Mona Lisa's kind of fun because he did that and gave her to Henry Geltsaler, who was then the curator at the Metropolitan for 20th Century Art, because at that time the Mona Lisa was on loan from the Louvre, and everyone was coming to see the Mona Lisa, and nobody was talking about anything else, and nobody was talking about his art, so he did the Mona Lisa.
I see. And we also have a picture of Mao, his portrait of Mao Zedong.
Well, now this is a silk screen, and he's also very well known for his prints, and they're quite gorgeous. And Mao, you know, in a way, Andy did to Mao what Mao had already done to himself. Mao was available on every billboard all over China as it was, and Andy just did more of him, and he did him about the same time he did Jimmy Carter, which I get a little bit of a kick out of. And he did 10 Maos. One of them has a blue lips and red face. They're all different colors all over the face.
Did you know him?
I'd met him at a couple of those parties he went to, and you know, and he said his deadpan thing, and he held out his tape recorder. He always taped everything, but I didn't know him very well. Others who knew him very well say that he really didn't seem to have a personal life, that his life was lived in public, that the life you saw was the life he had.
How will he be remembered in the history of 20th century American art? What will the impact be?
He's going to be remembered as a giant, I think. A, because he did so very well in himself symbolize, stand for what a very important part of our society. And also, he was incredibly influential. I mean, remember in the 60s, all those psychedelic photos? Well, they were all really photos like his Marilyn Monroe. And he continued to influence artists. And in the 80s, all the young artists, the graffiti artists, were artists that he took under his wing. And he showed them the technique of packaging a civilization, and then he took from them the ideas that they did, and he remained fresh. But he's continued to influence people, and I think he will continue to do so.
Maya Wallach, thank you for joining us.